This is the ops cross-section Think Big, and the topics that we're talking about today are near and dear to all of our hearts. It's about how do we run fewer tests by making use of monitoring data, and the flip-flop of that of how do we potentially monitor less by making use of test data. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, hopefully not too giant. And so everyone should be looking at the mural board that we're using now for the Think Big, Think Small. So we'll take about, let's say 20, 25 minutes to think big about this set of problems. I'm happy to flip-flop back and forth. I think there's a lot of overlap in both, so I don't think we have to go just down one track and then down the other. And then we'll flip over to the Think Small and think about potentially what could we actually pick up in, say, the 13.6 or 13.7 milestone. That may actually result in an issue that we pick up and run with for any of our teams, or even another team that isn't represented today. It may not. We'll see. But that's kind of the intent and how we've run with this format, at least in my group, of we always end up with an issue that we pick up in the next milestone to move us forward towards that larger Think Big. So I'm going to kick this off a little bit. The problems that I put into the doc that we would want to solve, things that we've been thinking about in testing and I've been thinking about for a long time is, especially with someone who's really adhered to that test-driven development and has that test pyramid and has thousands and thousands or even millions of probably unit tests or long-running integration tests, it just takes forever to run those tests, which can lead to a lot of wall clock time for a developer waiting for feedback, or a lot of expense if you're running massively parallel runners of trying to get all of these run in a decent amount of time, especially if you're doing it for every MR. So how do we leverage other data to selectively run some of those tests? So that's a problem that we have been thinking about. And then the flip of that, if we think about, well, we could use monitoring data, well, can you do the opposite of that and start to identify, here's areas of our application and our system that we want more granular monitoring on. If we're thinking about tracing and sampling, we want a higher percentage of those traces sampled because the code is flakier. The tests are flakier. There's connectivity problems, or there's downstream things that can really impact this area of our system. Is there potential there to have smarter monitoring? So those are the two problem spaces that we want to talk about today.
Can I ask a clarifying question? Do you mind?
Absolutely.
Okay. So what we're drilling in here, it sounds like it's reducing the amount of time spent triaging and testing problems that come out of tests from a developer. Like if we look at what an organization would benefit from this feature set, it's that we're making developers faster. Is that what you're thinking?
Faster in that their feedback loop is faster. So like the pipeline for GitLab takes an hour to get through all of the tests. Can we make that hour 30 minutes? Can we make it even 10 minutes? Because instead of running 170,000 unit tests across 12 jobs, you've run 17,000. Can we reduce that number of tests? That's that's the end goal, is that you reduce by some massive number how long it takes you to get feedback, but you still have a lot of confidence that you've tested the right things. Sorry, I'm trying to take notes of this one and looking at this one.
Yeah, I'll take notes, so don't worry about that part. I do have to leave early though, so I'll take notes as you talk.
Okay. Does that help clarify your question, or does that answer your question? Awesome. Any other problems here, or can we refine this problem statement some to make it more big? More big. My words are the best words this morning.
Just like maybe provide a bit of context from the monitor side. There are some like monitoring solutions that emerged from testing, specifically synthetic monitoring. So like synthetic monitoring are the scripts that you run. Let's say you do like a load testing. So you measure, like you record like some sort of a click-through script that like do a login and do something else. So usually you are doing it with load testing, but then what emerged from that is that operators realize that those scripts are very useful to monitor them in production. So they took those scripts from the test and they say, okay, instead of running like 1,000 or 10,000 for load, let's take one, run it like every 5 minutes, every 1 minute, or every 15 minutes. And this way I'll be able to like easily put some like monitoring system, like, and make sure that at least things are not breaking in production once I'm deploying any application.
Yep. So if we imagined that an organization had that synthetic monitoring, but they were doing it for every single integration test, even if you're only doing it once a day, you're potentially running thousands of those tests. And if you start to see, like, is it easy to lose the signal in there for where there's actually a new problem?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the second problem in the static monitoring world is that the maintainability is practically impossible.
Oh yeah.
So I guess, yeah, that was one of the problems there. So like maybe using tests like somehow can like help ease this pain on like maintaining scripts that run in production.
Yeah. And maintaining the scripts is always problematic. I wonder, is there any benefit though to an org if they're running fewer of those tests? Or instead of running every test once an hour, let's say your login just underwent a lot of change. And so we want to run the login script every 5 minutes for a while to make sure that that area is more rock solid in production. Or we want to monitor those systems more often because the tests are historically flaky over the last 30 days, where we've seen a lot of flapping in the test results of fixed, broke, fixed, broke. I feel like I'm presupposing solutions here, but I always feel that way when we think big.
I'm curious if this is a problem that has come up from existing users or if we're anticipating this need from the market.
I can say that I've felt this pain in previous roles working with tech ops teams. Development teams want all the monitoring, and it's just a huge amount of data that if you're using a SaaS provider is very expensive. If you're hosting yourself is very expensive and very expensive to maintain. And then you run into a performance problem. Like if you're trying to search across, terabytes of logs to find information, it's really hard and really slow. So is there a better way to, I've been thinking about this for a long time, is there a better way to get just the right data there that is going to be actionable? It tells the team what they need to know, but is timely as well. And I know there's a balance to be struck with, well, we don't know where problems are going to lie. And if we don't have monitoring on everything, how are we ever going to find it?
So like, there is this concept of, again, thinking out big here. Let's try to like flip the problem a bit, okay? First of all, I think that like monitoring production is super important, and it's a job by itself, obviously. And I find it hard to believe that there will be like operator that say, yes, I'm fine with less monitoring. Of course, they would like to do like less monitoring because it's an overhead, but it's like, it's super critical. If the application is mission critical, they don't want to skip on that. But like, if we look at it from the other side, let's say that if there is a way to analyze the user behavior, what is the most common flows that my users are doing? Let's say like 99% of my users do A, B, and C. Then I can take this data and take it back to maybe my testing and say, hey, we know like you have like a bunch of scripts that you run on test, but like the most important one, 90%, 99% of our users do this. So like this is the most critical thing for you to test. The other is like, of course it's important, but if you need to prioritize it, let's prioritize it based on the user action, and like not, or like don't prioritize like all the tests.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that when it comes to like APIs. If you're looking at this service, accepts, or 90% of the calls in our system go into this single API, and here are the top 3 things that call it. Let's always run those 3 integration tests as part of every single pipeline. And then we'll randomize the other integration points that we have. Is that a good way to have confidence while reducing your number of tests that are run?
I think this is first of all, yes. Okay. I think it will help spark some sort of a conversation between like, you know, ops and dev. I keep talking about like DevOps and ops dev. So this kind of conversation and this kinds of like alignment between what operators are running in production versus what is running on the test is super important. So
yeah.
like having this ability to like you know, bridge this gap, because I know we're talking about DevOps, but like in reality, like most of the enterprise customers, you know, they have their own monitoring tools in place, and it's very hard to bridge this gap. So bringing some production data insights into the development cycle and the test can focus the test effort for the developers. So I think it can be like super critical. No? You need to think about how do we do that, but this is the next step.
Hey, Jenny, this is Dan. I think Jackie asked this clarification question, but I'm just going to ask it again to make sure I'm on the same page. So test, in this case, are we talking about unit tests?
It could be any test. So I think mostly about unit tests because that's the broad part of the pyramid and what really can take a long time to run as you start to run into hundreds of thousands of tests. But I think it's equally important when you talk about long running integration or end-to-end tests. Those can have an equal penalty when it comes to wall clock time. When you're thinking about, you know, how long does it take for a pipeline to get to finish running? And it doesn't matter. Like I think about the pipeline running as it doesn't matter if it's green or red. If I get a result and it's feedback, great. Like that's what I want. Obviously, I want more of my pipelines to be green, but I just want my feedback faster. So I've kind of focused on unit tests, but I think this applies across the board.
Okay, and just a last quick question and really fast. And sorry, I have to kind of just pop off at 10 as well for a vendor call. But when we say way too long, generally, are we thinking about, hey, the test should be less than an hour, less than 2 hours? Do we have a ballpark range in terms of the timing?
So what we've been thinking about in testing, like our super long-term vision is that you can go from opening an MR to running that code in production in an hour. And so that is our really think big, like big audacious goal. And that MR is not going to be like, hey, I just spun up a brand new feature with front-end, back-end database, you know, it's scales, HA, all of that. But you should be able to get an MR opened. And even if you think about it as like a text change and you're just running linters on it, hey, you should be able to get it out into prod within an hour. It's probably more likely it's like, hey, here's a front-end JavaScript change. So I've changed some functionality, I've changed some code, but I have confidence that this change isn't a breaking change. And there's a lot more than just testing that goes on with that. But testing is a big component of it because it can take a big chunk of the pipeline.
Yeah, for me, I think by you introducing JavaScript, you kind of noodle on the next kind of place my mind went is this is such a big problem space is that you almost have to kind of potentially say, oh, let's kind of maybe focus on front-end applications, and then maybe only, you know, JavaScript devs, or maybe it's microservices for Java, because it's so different depending on what kind of app you're talking about, what kind of change. Yeah, interesting. Okay.
That would be a wild goal for, let's say, a mainframe. That may not be the best use case for it, but.
I have another question.
Yeah.
So right now we're focused on this developer wait time and supporting your super long-term vision to get this down to like 60 minutes for a change to be made into production. And you're seeing that the largest bottleneck is tests, right? So is there something that can be done more proactively inside of GitLab to show people that they do have test waste now? And maybe that's where like we're seeing really long running jobs on and tests on files that weren't even changed, and bringing that to the attention of users so that they can reduce test waste.
We're going down that path a little bit with the TFS test file finder, where we have a template that you can apply. It's very language specific to Ruby today, but we're working on expanding it, where it runs as a new stage, just the tests for the files that were changed. And so it just pulls those tests out and runs them first, so you can get that feedback loop faster. That then you still run your full suite of tests. And so we're starting to think about then that next suite. Is there a way to, especially in your merge request pipelines, run fewer of those tests and get that same quality of feedback, but in a shorter amount of time that doesn't require throwing money at the problem? So trying to strike that balance between, hey, I've gotten everything I need and I didn't just spend $1,000 on this pipeline. So yes, and we're exploring. I rambled a long way to get to yes, and we're exploring that.
I think what I'm interested in is like we have a monitoring production metric that suggests this has been stable in the last 90 days, and your tests are running really, really long.
Yeah.
You should evaluate if those tests are necessary or not, or even in the inverse, that you're having a lot of instability in your production instances, and we're seeing that your tests are high. Are your tests working?
Yep. So I think that could apply to, if we go into the weeds a little bit, if you have an API that is often returning errors, then you would want to track that back to, we want to test this integration more often. If you have an API that's super solid and stable, you can test it less often. So maybe there's some sort of mapping then between your GitLab monitoring solution and your GitLab testing, where you could say, here's all of my tests, and I want to apply lottery factor to them based on success in production, because I know that these unit tests go with this API endpoint, and it is rock solid. So I'm going to only run 10% of those in every test, and it's just going to be randomized, or in every pipeline, and it's just going to be randomized. And then you could do, you can start to play with that with gauges potentially, so that you could get confidence as a combination of a dev team and an operator team, if you're split that way, or just as a development team, if you're doing full on DevOps, of how much do I really need to test? Is that kind of what you were thinking, Jackie?
Yeah, it's more like using a lagging indicator to inform what your next step is. Yeah.
So I think that we've kind of started to explore the who has this problem. We've talked a lot about the developer and the DevOps personas. These are tiny. Hold on. These are giant on my screen, and I can't even read them. Are there other personas who we should include here who have this problem?
Yeah, I definitely agree with Sasha. I know you asked a question about if there are other personas. I don't have an answer to that, but I know you talked about this at the beginning of the call. I'm still a little bit curious about the DevOps persona, the Dev 1, DevOps engineer, trying to reduce monitoring logging. And I know that that's part of the goals that you have in the ThinkBIG as a second green item. But I guess I'm just kind of struggling with that whole idea of, if you reduce the test surface, right, or reduce the time it takes to set test surface, leave it at that. If you reduce the test surface, I struggle to see how that then translates to reducing, what we monitor and log in a production environment to ensure that we hit SLOs or SLAs. You know what I mean?
So for me, this is the flip-flop of that, where we say that, hey, we have test history, and we see that a combination of the unit tests within this module and the integration tests of this module have all passed 100% for the last 90 days. So if we're monitoring that area of our production system, instead of saying, hey, I want every single log and I want every single trace, I can say, I really only need 10% of the logs and 10% of the traces. And so the amount of storage and the amount of data going into, say, Grafana shrinks, but you still get signal. But you're doing that because you have confidence that it's a well-tested, solid piece of code that you have, like if you have fuzz testing, maybe even that goes up some more because you have extra confidence around the edges and the funkiness that can happen with weird inputs. So a combination of things that could happen in tests that result in still data, but less of it. And that results in lower storage costs for you potentially when it comes to monitoring, because it just gets crazy expensive to start storing terabytes and terabytes of data. I worked with a monitoring logging team, and that was always the battle of, listen, we can't continue to throw hardware at this problem. We're storing so much data and you're doing nothing with it. And development teams coming back saying, yeah, but what about when we have a problem? We're going to need the data. And so to be able to have tests come into that and say, hey, we've tested this continuously for 90 days and it's rock solid. We'll still give you some data, but we're just going to reduce how much of it.
I think, James, that what you just said to me is a really nice articulation of the interesting problem statement of pain point. That kind of like, hey, I'm a dev. Everything went well when I created this code and ran my unit test, and a few months later, something broke in production, and I'm trying to figure out what broke, right? And so I'm now reliant on these logs, and then the DevOps engineer is like, dude, we don't want to. Oh, I shouldn't have said that. Darren, we don't want to store all of these logs because we never know if we're actually going to use it. I think that's a really, really solid. I'm not sure if we have that pain point, but I think that's really interesting to think about too.
I'm speaking more from personal experience of I've had this pain of, like, even if you have all of that data, how could you possibly find problems in it? Because there's just so much of it. Like, trends are buried because you have to know what the problem looks like to slice and dice to find it anyway. So, like, where's the value in doing it? Whereas if there's a huge problem in a small sampling, you're still going to find it. Like, if you introduce a problem that breaks that system entirely, you're going to get that signal still.
I wonder how like a system who is using test-driven development would respond to testing less as a result of production performance, because those teams are expecting that their behaviors are driven by having lots of tests and constant evaluation of production states.
I mean, I think as you're introducing new functionality, you want to test that and make sure that's solid. But going back to that, like, we wrote this code a year ago. We haven't touched it since then. Tests haven't failed since then. In production, it looks great. So I really need to run those 80 tests every single pipeline. Cool. So we have thought big about this for a while. I want to try to get Jackie and Darren's thoughts on ideal solution before they have to run. They have about 90 seconds to do that. So putting them both on the spot. Darren unmuted first, so I'm going to say go. What would an ideal solution look like?
I don't know if I have an ideal solution, because I'm struggling with creating if I were just kind of thinking about an MVC type product to solve this, I'm struggling in terms of thinking about what that is. So what I'm going to lean on is really quickly an example. And I think I talked to you about this a bit before, James, in our one-on-one. An example of what we did for Nike Inc.'s cloud acceleration team and for all of Nike Inc.'s, plethora of applications, right? The approach we took for testing was for the 1,600 development teams at Nike, we said, you tell us what tests you think are important to run for your application. That's kind of like step one. And so that meant that the team had the ability to narrow or widen the aperture in terms of how broad or how narrow the test should be. Yep. And then they said, okay, like in Darren's case, I only need to run 3 tests in order for this MR to go to production. So if these 3 tests pass, cool, the code goes to production. James's app might need 10 tests because it's more complex, whatever. So that's the way we started at first. And then, so the development team defined the quality gate for their test, right? And we put it in the system. And then the next thing that we did was, okay, now that you've defined the quality gate, right, or parameters for that particular type of application or change or what have you. Now on the monitoring side, you can start seeing, okay, over time, are changes related to that area of the code base causing problems in terms of availability or bugs being raised or trouble ticket, incident tickets or what have you. And so we try to allow them to correlate the two. And so that's the path we had gone down. And so I don't have a solid answer to your question, but I was just kind of imagining how we had done something related in the past and how it might fit into this. But I don't have a solid answer for you. Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Awesome. Thanks,
I
Derek.
think as an MVC, I would like to see a place where all my tests are, like in aggregate, in relationship to their production stability. So being able to quickly see how long are my jobs running specific just to my tests and how performant are they in production. And I could see a second iteration being like, hey, your production has been stable for 90 days. You might want to reconsider the test you're running as like a nudge or a trigger, and then allowing them to select inside of GitLab opportunities to remove tests from pipelines. And then a further iteration can be even proactive, like on the MR widget, hey, you can skip this testing job because this is making a change to a file that's been stable, or whatever language makes sense. But I could see this interaction of it being, here's push data and then intervening your changes in the pipeline.
Yeah, I like it. Thanks, Jackie.
Yeah, so my thought was very similar to what Jackie mentioned. First of all, to see some sort of a comparison, because like we have an assumption. And our assumption is if you have like if your environment is stable, then you need less tests, or vice versa. But first of all, in order to prove this assumption, we need to have some sort of a comparison. Like, see, okay, let's first see what we have. And if we see that there is a correlation between like number of tests and the stability, then we can start playing with that. But at least let's make sure we are not assuming something that is not correct. So this would be like my very first thing that I would build, but very similar to what Jackie mentioned.
I wonder if there'd be a way to, with existing data in GitLab, if someone has is using the GitLab monitoring, and we have some sort of tracking of their production system, and we can see error rates or traces, or I don't know, maybe even like 500 errors on APIs. We can map that back to an API test and say, here's the test history of that test for the last n runs. That's capability that we'll have in like one milestone. And say, this API, this is what it looks like in production. Here's what the test for that API looks like. And just bubble it up to say, here's your top 10 flaky tests and how the API behaves, and here's your top 10 error rates of APIs, and here's how the tests behave, the history of the tests. And just build a page that shows that data and only track if people go to it and see, hey, do people think that this is valuable or not? That's all we want to know, is if people are looking at the data.
Yeah, and like one thing that we can take from that is maybe, you know, when you have tests that are flaky, then you can say, hey, like your tests are flaky, like why won't you create like some sort of a monitoring template from that you can quickly deploy to production together with this.
So like identification of within your flaky test, you could say you have monitoring, you don't have monitoring for what this test is testing. Oh yeah, I like that. That's good.
And like if we can do it like seamlessly or like as easy as possible, then it will even encourage users to use like more of our, you know, of our monitoring.
That's a very subtle way to say, you don't have any monitoring for this.
No, if you don't, we can, like in the push of a button, we can do something.
Like
MVC
deploy
can be
Prometheus, and here's your
but Yeah, and as an MVC, it could be like an empty page that you need to do by yourself, and afterward you can like.
Yeah, I like that. Of like on test history, you could say, here's your top 10 flaky tests. Yeah, here's how the endpoint is behaving in production. Oh, we don't know because you haven't set up monitoring. Would you like to set up some monitoring so you can see?
Yeah.
we could help drive that that category a little bit.
Yeah.
Cool. So what about from the monitoring side? Is there something that we could leverage? Because I don't know the capabilities of the category very well. Is there something that we could take as is today? Because I know that we don't have investment there on the development side.
Yeah.
To utilize for either of these problem spaces. Like, is there an MVC approach that we could take from the testing side or contribute code back into monitor that would help solve either of these problems?
Like the only way I can think about it is like that when I don't think it's related to the problem description that you have, but let's just like let's just brainstorm a bit. I mean, the advantage that we have in GitLab is that we have access to the people that actually write the code and write the test. They can also write the monitoring, because like basically monitoring now is a piece of code that you add, or some sort of piece of configuration that you add, ideally as quickly as quickly as possible. You don't wait for things to deploy in production and only afterward you deploy monitoring. You want to have this monitoring somehow embedded, like within your, similar to how you do like unit tests in run your test. You want to have monitoring enabled, maybe in the CI when you create your pipeline, or even before, like when you instrument your code, you do it when you develop your code, or when you write after. So how can we like take something from test and use it? Probably somewhere in the instrumentation part, but I'm not sure how.
When you're setting up monitoring, do we have like thresholds for how much we're going to sample for like the sampling rates, I guess, or the tracking rates?
Yeah, there is. So there is like some sort of probably like an out of the box setting that we set by Prometheus, which obviously you can change. So yeah, maybe that's a good idea. Like changing the sample rate based off like how flaky the test is, because obviously if the sample rate is high, then you test more, you add more data, and as you mentioned, it's too big to handle.
Yeah.
So this is something that can easily change, like the sampling rate. And I'm pretty sure that there is an API to it.
Just keep going back to, there's got to be a way to map then the test back to what it monitors and vice versa. I think that's the hardest part of this problem to solve, is how do you get from production monitoring back to a test or a set of tests? Or at least that's the problem I don't have an answer to. I haven't dug in too far.
One thing that we can do is just like if you instrument your code, and you identify a problem on your monitor side, then you can go back to where you instrument the code, because eventually you are detecting that something is broken, and that's great. But maybe if you can go and see, okay, to which class does it map in my code, then maybe I can focus my test based on that specific section of the code. I mean, you understand what I'm saying? It's like you're going from the monitor side directly to the code line.
So like if you're implementing tracing, you have to instrument that within the code. So as you're doing that, I'm just trying to, where was I going? My train of thought got derailed. Have a view then of, like, it's, for me, it's almost like a coverage report of, I can see within the code, like where there's test coverage, and I can see where it's instrumented for tracing. I can see, in addition to my tests, like if you're looking at the web IDE or like the raw file view, you can say, hey, this is covered by a test. Here's this test history. Hey, this is covered by tracing. Here's the error rate in production for the last 90 days. Like you would have the same thing on the same line, or have those two data points on that line, potentially. And then if you extract that data out into a view, you could say, hey, here's error rates from your tracing data that you've instrumented in your code. Here's test rates for the same kind of code where we see that mapping within the file. And here's where potentially you can make a change to decrease your test runs. I think I'm back over into think big instead of think small.
Yeah, because I know that like a lot of time when you identify something is broken in your monitoring, you want to trace back and say, okay, what did I monitor here? Because okay, I got like this error rate, I can investigate, but eventually you go back to the code and you want to understand, okay, what happened?
Yeah.
What broke the app? And it's very helpful if you'll be able to go to that specific area where you did the tracing, and it's like narrowing down the search of where to look at when you want to investigate your code. So like if you want to try to understand, okay, what are the steps that you can do? It's like when you have like some sort of an error rate, threshold violation, something like that, maybe you can have some sort of a clip that takes you to the code, do some sort of a code search and take you to that line of code to say, okay, this is where you instrumented. And then you can see if you have tests there as well. And if you don't, say, okay, maybe I should run some tests, or maybe should add some tests to my code.
So working backwards from tracing from an error, able to see where tracing was instrumented, and if there's a test for that line of code, and what that test's history is. Yeah, I think that's really I think that's a thread that we can pull on with the dev team is, or with the dev team, and say, hey, how can we get from tracing data back to instrumentation back to a test? Like, how do we connect those three dots and then pull the data into a view? I would think that would be like kind of the minimum viable here of, I want to run fewer tests. The first thing I have to know is which tests are important that I have to run.
Or maybe I'm missing tests or something like that.
Yeah, or if you're missing tests, like if you have a high error rate and there's no test that maps up to something, like here's areas of code where you would want to.
The opposite. We're adding tests. You wanted to remove. Remove tests.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think it's an interesting conversation to have about, should we remove these tests because the code is solid, or should we just run them less often? I don't know which one is right. I don't think there's anyone who would say we should get rid of tests for code that we're still shipping. I could be wrong. Cool. Anything else you want to wrap up on the Think Small Dev?
I'm just thinking, like, if Sarah was here, she would probably ask, how can we do something around like incident management? Like when we identify the problem, like how can we?
I don't know the incident management workflow too well, so I don't know that I could speak to that, or I wouldn't feel confident, because all of my assumptions all of my thoughts would be assumptions on the topic.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we can just like, I mean, if we have this capability, the way to surface this capability will be through an incident. When you have this incident, you can maybe attach some sort of like a report, or maybe some sort of a blob that says, okay, you have tracing, you have testing, click here, and it takes you to the code where
Yeah.
where your tracing are, where your tests are.
We need to declare an incident. I think you do it by creating a new issue. It's a new issue type that creates an incident. From there, I don't know what the life cycle of an incident is, though.
Like, you know, someone is getting assigned to the incident, obviously, and then do this whole root cause analysis or triage of the problem until the incident is getting closed. Like, I'm probably butchering the the workflow, but
well, I guess then if you extend that to thinking about, hey, we're going to attach it to like this data blob of the monitoring that was happening during the time, then I think that workflow of now you can track back to the code and you can see if there's tests and how those tests behave on the last MR. Like that would be an interesting way to tie that together. And if you're able to quickly identify, like when you create your incident, if you're coming out of your monitoring view and say, I'm creating an incident, here's the error rates in the chunk of time and in the system that we identified the error, then on the back end, you can start to stitch that together so that it's just added into the issue, I think.
Yeah, and even if we think beyond our monitoring capability, which we know we don't have a lot of investment there, maybe we can attach some sort of an external monitoring solution to that incident. So this way you'll be able to, you know, work with other vendors. So it's actually a good problem validation to conduct for incident management.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I think I can take a couple of these anyway and at least brainstorm them with my team on the testing side. I think there's some interesting things here to try to poke at. Some of these MVCs might even be a think big for us as we try to explore the monitor space a little bit. But I guess definitely, I mean, it's really interesting for us to think about how do we run fewer tests with the same amount or even higher confidence in the code that's going out. So this has been really helpful for me anyway, selfishly, of course.
It was interesting to me as well. Unfortunately, I don't have anything to take for CI, I think, for now. Maybe Sarah can take some things for monitoring or for incident management.
Yeah, I mean, I think as we think about this, like this will dip into CI or pipeline authoring though, as we start to, like, can you build a GitLab CI YAML and as part of your test config, set it up to be dynamic of like insert lottery factor and tests selectively run within your test job based on your monitoring data that you have, but that it keeps itself kind of updated without having to rewrite the test scripts or rewrite the CI, the GitLab CI YAML or whatever that might be. There's some interesting things I think we could do there.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, hey, thanks, Dov. I appreciate it. As always, great to talk to you. Appreciate your thoughts on this topic.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.